Go ahead and have turning in your Bibles to Psalm 57, 1 through 11, as we continue our study of the prayers of people in trouble. And in particular, this is one that deals with when you are surrounded, I would say surrounded by your enemies. At a middle school in Oregon, not too long ago, there were some middle school girls who were acting, well, like middle school girls. They were putting on lipstick, and then they were sneaking into the boys' bathroom, and they were pressing their lips up against the mirror and leaving lip print marks everywhere. It's really not, kind of harmless, but the janitor got really tired of cleaning them up, and it was really difficult to clean up all of that lipstick mark, and he was just pretty frustrated with it, and so he asked the principal to do something about it. And so the principal called all of the girls into the gym for a demonstration of how this mirror had to get cleaned every day. They went into the gym, and he had like a little mock bathroom set up. So there was a mirror, and there was a toilet, and it had lipstick prints on it already. He said, I don't really care who has been doing it, but just wanted you to know that you're making life difficult for our janitor to clean it up every day. And so I just wanted you to watch how he cleans it so that you will understand what he's going through. And so he called the janitor over, who came over with one of those little long-handled brushes, and he stuck it into the toilet and swirled it around the water and cleaned off the mirror and walked off. They didn't have any more problems. Now, I don't know if that's really how they clean the mirrors, but there was not one mid-high girl who wanted to put their lips on that mirror just in case that's how he cleaned it. It's interesting how the truth will often change our behavior if we believe that's what is true. It will impact our lives, and we will act accordingly to what we understand is true. Psalms 57 returns us to the time when David and his men had fled King Saul, and they were hiding out in that damp, dark cave in the wilderness of Ziph. It wasn't just one cave in which they hung out in, but it was sort of like a network of caves that they took refuge in. And so they were always moving from one place to another, so they really were difficult to find. While we focused our study last week on David's deliverance from the pit of destruction that he considered himself in, this week we're going to focus on another of his prayers from that pit as his enemies surrounded him, closing the proverbial noose around his neck. Like most of us do when we're in trouble, David prayed more than once, which shouldn't surprise you, as David had plenty of time to pray while hiding from King Saul. It's estimated that he spent somewhere between 3 and 6 months quarantined in that pit of destruction in these caves, hiding out for his life. Part of the instructions that David gave to the music director for this particular song was, "Do not destroy." The director would have known exactly what David meant, but that meaning has been lost over time, so it's uncertain what David wanted him to understand. Was al-tashhith, that is, do not destroy, the tune that was supposed to be used? Or was it that David didn't want the director to discard it? Or was it the theme to be addressed? One take on what David meant by do not destroy, which I ran across my studies this week, got me thinking about the context of David's prayer from a little bit of a different angle. It was suggested that perhaps do not destroy was a reference to David's struggle to keep from retaliating against King Saul. If you recall, David had made a commitment not to raise his hand against God's anointed, against King Saul, despite what King Saul did, his obsession with hunting down David in particular. David was not going to repay evil with evil. He would not do anything that would destroy King Saul, no matter what opportunities presented themselves. David was convinced that God did not want him to respond that way. which is a far cry from what I've been hearing about this weekend, and you probably have too, as rioters have destroyed property and even run one mayor from his offices as they broke into it in their rampage. They said that this was only their way of drawing attention to the injustice that they had suffered, and what they really want is revenge. When asked why they had turned to violence, they said, well, you can't be violent against property. You can't be violent against a window. So from their perspective, they're not being violent. I'm quite certain that none of them are singing a song to the tune of Do Not Destroy, especially not one like David sang, which begins by asking God to be gracious to him, that his real refuge was not the caves that he was hiding out in, but his real refuge was being in the shadow of God's wings. If necessary, David said, he would stay hidden in these caves until his enemies passed by. He was confident that in God's way and in God's time, God would send forth from heaven what he needed to be saved from his situation, even though it didn't look very good at the time. David may not have been able to stand up against King Saul's forces in a pitched battle, but he could best King Saul's forces in covert operations, which David and his men did, and they conducted while they were hiding out in these caves. On one occasion, David was sort of lamenting that he could not enjoy the cool waters from the well by the gate of Bethlehem because the Philistines had surrounded and were encamped by Bethlehem. King Saul had not yet run them off, and so thinking that this would be a surprise for David, 3 of his mighty men left the caves. They avoided King Saul's army. They broke through the Philistine lines, and they drew water from that well and brought it back to David. But David wouldn't drink it, even though they were quite successful in their adventure. He realized that his personal desire for this water had put his men's lives at risk. It was a selfish desire, and David felt that his men should only risk their lives for fulfilling God's will and not his. These men were capable men. One of them, we're told, went to battle 300 men, and only using a spear, he defeated all 300 of them. So while David's forces were small, they were pretty mighty men. They were a fearsome force. But even so, David didn't want them to use their God-given strengths and abilities to advance his personal desires. He would instead wait upon the Lord to pour out his loving kindness and reveal his truth. And at least part of that truth was that David was not King Saul's enemy, but he was the man that God was raising up to be the next king. On the other side of things, King Saul felt that David was his enemy. He hated King Saul. He hated David. And he acted accordingly. He split his energy and his time between hunting David and between pushing out the Philistines from his country, and he was not very successful in doing either one. On one occasion, King Saul was given a tip about David's location from the Ziphites. Now, the Ziphites, and what a terrible name for a city, especially if you were trying to figure out a mascot for them, but they were people who lived in a small town that was near the wilderness area where this cave system was, and they had noticed David and his men going in and out. They knew approximately where he was at, and they went to King Saul with this information. King Saul told them to spy out exactly where David was in hiding and return to him. But using the information he did receive, he went on the hunt. He started out after David, and King Saul might very well have found him, but King Saul's son Jonathan heard that he'd got this inside information, and he took off in front of King Saul and got word to David that King Saul was on his way, knowing approximately where he was at. And so David and his men actually took off and went around one side of the mountain while King Saul was coming on this side. It's almost kind of like a game of cat and mouse. And while he was in the middle of hunting down David, he got news that the Philistines were making yet another advance, and so he took off to confront the Philistines. And on returning from that battle, King Saul received word again from another Ziphite spy who said, "Hey, we know exactly where David is." And so the king took about 3,000 men. Now David had those mighty men, but he was no match for 3,000 of King Saul's men, and he set out to hunt down David because now he knew exactly where he was at. And as anyone is prone to do on a hunting trip, King Saul had to find sort of a private place to relieve himself. And he just so found that private place in the very same cave that David and his men were hiding out in the back recesses of. Now that was obviously a coincidence, right? What could have been a God kind of thing. Saul was no match by himself for any of David's men. David's men felt that this was God's way of delivering their enemy into their hands. They felt that this was the answer to David's prayer to be saved. They urged David to take this opportunity and to assassinate King Saul. They told David that all he really needed to do was just step out in faith and walk through this door of opportunity that God had surely opened for him. But David recognized this advice as advancing a purely human plan and not one that God had revealed to anyone. You know, sometimes we disguise our own personal desires as God's word so we can get what we want. But evidently, David was wise enough to understand that someone else was influencing his men to give him such bad advice. While King Saul was, as we would say, taking care of business, David crept so close to him in the cave that he was able to cut off the hem of King Saul's garment without King Saul recognizing or realizing it. But David did nothing else. The king left the cave unharmed, and David returned back into the recesses of it to talk to his men. David admitted to them that he felt terribly guilty for what he did, for taking the hem of King Saul's garment, because even that impugned the king's reputation, and that was a form of destroying him too. Even if it was only property, he was committed not to do anything to destroy King Saul. David also persuaded his men not to take out after King Saul and catch him on the road, which they could have easily done. You see, as you read through this song, it should become apparent that David was really struggling with what God wanted him to do. How was he supposed to respond to the situation he found himself? What was it that God wanted him to do? There were so many temptations, even in the words of his valued men, to take matters into his own hands. And there were so many justifications that he could have brought out to soothe himself so that he could do what he wanted. But just because David had the opportunity to strike a blow against King Saul did not mean that it was what God wanted him to do, or how God had planned to lift him up out of the pit. In this song, David cried out for God's pardon and protection. He really was in trouble. You might ask, why did he need to be pardoned since he was doing well? Because desperation was nudging him in the wrong way. He was beginning to do the very sorts of things that he committed not to do. David needed and desired God's tender mercies, his grace, and his refuge until the threat of wanting to destroy Saul had passed, until Saul was also gone. And just in case you're wondering, the word for destruction that David used in verse 1 is not the same word that he used in the title, nor is it the same word that we talked about last week whenever the pit was described as one of destruction. It was the same word that David used in Psalm 52:7, though, where David sang, "Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desires. That last word, evil desires, is the same one translated destruction in the psalm we're looking at today. It is the same sort of falling or destruction that happened whenever Adam and Eve fell. It is by evil desire enacting on them rather than turning to God's way. But instead of falling into this trap, David was confident that God would send from heaven what he needed to be rescued, to be saved. I know that this may sound repetitive, but you might still be wondering, from what did David really need to be saved? There are several good answers to that question, but one of them is that David needed to be saved from his own evil desires, from the temptation to take matters into his own hands. Yes, David and his men were literally surrounded by their enemies, King Saul's forces. He described them in this psalm as lions, which made me think of Jesus' description of Satan, who was acting like a prowling lion, hunting for someone to devour. David compared King Saul and his forces as that which breathes fire. My mind immediately envisioned a pack of fire-breathing dragons, but I'm sure that's not what David envisioned or had in mind. I think he was referring to how the abundance of their heart was flaming out of their mouths with slander and hate and lies about him. The things that are spoken of whenever you're filled with the heat of rage. And just in case we didn't pick up on that connection, David pushed this comparison further, saying that they were like the sons of Adam whose teeth and tongues were weapons. You've probably known some people like that in your lifetime. Whoever made up that old adage that says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me," never met the sort of people that David was describing. Their slanderous words hurt David very much. They called him a traitor to the king, a usurper. They used those words to turn people against him, made him an outlaw, someone who could be hunted down, and they could justify doing so, even though not one thing they said was true about David. David was well aware that the trap had been set for him, not just the physical one, but the spiritual one as well. He was equally confident that they would be the ones who ended up falling into it. They would act on their own evil desires, and they would be destroyed as a result of it. And yes, if you're wondering, David used yet another word to describe this sort of falling. This time, the word actually means to physically fall, because that's how prey ends up a pit that's being used to hunt. You would dig a pit, and then you would chase your prey to it, and then they would fall into it. But David was confident that instead of him, King Saul and his men would be falling into it. David, even though surrounded by his enemies, says, "I'm going to sing praises to God. Even though I don't see the way out of this, I'm going to do what's right. Even though I don't know how I'm going to get out of this." And he's going to do it with such voice and with such vigor and with such might and with all of his instruments that everyone around him is going to hear his praises in the midst of his troubles. He would keep steadfast. He would keep trusting God. And let me tell you, that is hard to do when you look up and you just don't think there's any way you're going to get out of this. But David gives praise to God. What David did reminds me of what Paul and Silas did, singing praises when they were held in the prison of Philippi. Everyone could hear them singing their praises. In fact, they were probably keeping those people away, but their praises formed a witness to the guards that they trusted in God to save them. When the earthquake came later that night, forcing open the prison doors, providing an opportunity for escape, Paul and Silas realized that this was not the work of God. This was not how God was going to provide for them a way of escape. Like David, Paul and Silas waited upon the Lord. They remained in their cells and they encouraged the other prisoners from escaping. And it eventually led to the Philippian jailer's conversion and eventually even his own family. And ultimately Paul and Silas's deliverance and their release. As for David, he left his men at the back of the cave, and he went out after Saul. He was good at covert operations. He snuck up close enough to King Saul that he could cry out and King Saul could hear him. And what he cried out to Saul, just think of what you're going to say to your enemy who's trying to hunt you down and kill you. And David said, "My Lord and my King." And King Saul turned around, recognizing David's voice, and said, "Is it you?" And when he turned and looked, there was David on the road, bowed down before him. And he asked King Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of the men who say, 'Behold, David seeks to harm you'?" Then he told the king what had happened in the cave. That he could have destroyed him. He had the opportunity. He even held up the hem of his garment as proof that he could have killed him. But he says, "There's no evil and there's no rebellion in my hands. I have not sinned against you." That conversation goes on for a while, described in the scriptures. They spoke at length. King Saul, at the end of it, finally realizes the truth about himself. He is brought to tears over his own evil behavior. He admits that David really had shown him kindness while he was dealing with David wickedly. King Saul quotes a proverb, I think as much to himself as anything else. He says, "If a man finds his enemy, he will not let him go away safely, will he?" Showing that David didn't consider him an enemy. And so he tells David, "May the Lord reward you for the kindness that you have shown me this day." And accepting that David posed no threat to him, King Saul made David affirm by oath that he would never do so, which David gladly did because it affirmed the truth. And it was also that day that King Saul realized that David really would be the one that God was raising up to be the next king. And he gathered his men and he headed back to Jerusalem, never to pursue David in that way again. No wonder at the end of David's psalm is this great praise for the deliverance that God had brought to him. He's saying, "I will give thanks to you, O Lord, amongst the people. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your loving kindness is great to the heavens, your truth to the clouds. Be exalted above the heavens, O God, let your glory be above all the earth." You know, we sing those kinds of things when we've been delivered. So the next time that you're surrounded by your enemies, the next time that you're being nudged toward acting on your own evil desires, I encourage you to remember this psalm and try dealing with it God's way. And you might just find yourself singing God's praises. We have a hymn of invitation that we're going to use. If you've been struggling along against your troubles, trying to enact your own will, to get your own way, it's time to give it up. It's time to turn to God and act like his people who are expressing his love, even to the very ones who are causing us trouble. Would you please stand?